I'm going to be audacious for a moment. I'm going to pose a question. How can we use design principles to change the world? I want you to think about that for a little bit. And I guess the second thing is what is design principles? What is it to be a design thinker? I've never thought of myself as a designer or as a design thinker. In fact, I didn't even know what that was until recently. As I started, researching a little bit and reading up about it, I thought, you know what? In a sense, I am a designer, just a different kind of designer. And I liked some of the definitions I was looking up. I was looking at design thinking. One of the definitions was visualizing or creating something that is outside of the ordinary. It's something beyond our grasp. It's not inductive or deductive reasoning. It's something that is greater than something that already exists. It's outside of the box. And so we do try to apply some of those things in my work. And I also saw design thinking and good design thinking as solving problems in a certain sense, just as good business solves problems. And there are a number of ways we can apply design thinking and design work to solving various problems. And the problem that I spend most of my time on trying to solve and work on is the problem of global poverty. And to give you a little taste of that, the majority of the world, 2/3 of the world, live in homes like this one right here. 2/3 of the world. So we in this room, we're in the vast minority of the world. The majority of the people live like this. They live on roughly $4 a day. They live in homes like this one above, eking out a living, day by day. 30,000 children under the age of 5 die each day in this type of environment in the developing world. Most people don't have access to clean water, health care. They pay what we call the poverty penalty, which is, in essence, people at the base of the pyramid, at this poor, the base of the economic pyramid, the poorest of the poor, they pay more for products and services than we do. It costs more to buy a T-shirt in this environment than it does at Walmart down the street. So they suffer from a number of these things. And oftentimes they turn to the market as finding ways to survive. They try to eke out a living by selling something and maybe trying to be innovative and creative with a local product to create something that has value for somebody else that they can potentially sell. But oftentimes these are individuals who haven't grown up in a market economy. Maybe they know nothing about business. They have very little education. They don't know how to operate in this space. And so design thinkers have come along and worked in this space, I'd say more regularly of late, and mostly on designing products for the poor. Like for here, designing an innovative technology through solar power that can recharge cell phones, power a radio, like in this case here, light bulbs, or perhaps it's designing low-cost access to water, like with digging this well, or it's designing low-cost, easy-to-use tools or products to move that water once it comes out of the well through this water wheel. But the kind of design thinking, I think if I was to even consider myself a designer at all, it would be outside of all this type of design that we're talking about here today. What I focus on is designing business models for these markets. And how do we design models that can grow and scale and take these types of products to the 4 billion people that live at the base of the pyramid? And design thinking is very important. Because if we don't think as designers and we leave design thinking up to the consumer, we get the African Bluetooth. And although this Kenyan, it's working for him, it may not be the most effective Bluetooth out there. And I think we can do it more effectively, and we can also do it less painfully. And so I spend most of my time trying to figure that out. And not only designing business models that work in these environments, but also designing for-profit business models. Because I think being for-profit is also a very large key. And I know that may sound funny or different because traditionally we've always thought if you want to change the world, if you want to do something great, you join a nonprofit. You go do humanitarian work. And that's how you change the world. Well, that's changing. And I'd offer up the idea today that that is no longer the way to change the world. And if you want to change the world, you get involved with for-profit business in these countries. And a recent report coming out from the Monitor Institute shows this graph here. And it shows this variation between philanthropic giving and globally managed assets going into foreign direct investment or invested otherwise in the market. And if we look at the philanthropic giving, it's a fraction. It's 0.3 trillion, right? And that includes higher education, that includes humane society, that includes money that's going to cancer research, medical areas. A very small proportion of that actually goes internationally to economic development. That actually help those 4 billion, which is a large population, 4 billion poor that really need that assistance. So what I suggest is that we try to figure out ways that we can access larger amounts of capital that we can use to scale and really impact that segregation or that segment of the population. And it's very simple, actually. The more profit you make, the more incentive you have to scale, which has a larger impact. And this is where we spend most of our time is working in this space. Now, it's taken me a while. I didn't just wake up yesterday and think, you know what, we need to switch from humanitarianism to for-profit business design. It's been a process that's been running through my mind for the last 13 years. And I want to share with you a few of the lessons we've learned along the way that helped it get to this point. And it all began one day, and I'm going to confess something here a little bit. It took me 10 years to get an undergraduate degree, so I'm not the brightest person that will be up here today by any stretch of the imagination. But I found myself in those lost years, that 10-year period, in the Himalayas. And I was sitting up, this is Mount Everest, this is me at 20,000 feet. And being a poor ski bum at the time, I couldn't afford to climb the big peak, so I had to only go to 20,000. The permits were too expensive to go any higher. But as I found myself here in the Himalayas, and I was in Kathmandu, this was my first time really seeing poverty and seeing the way that the rest of the world lived, and that my life and my bubble and my world wasn't reality, that the reality was nearly everybody else on this planet. And I ended up meeting a number of homeless children in Kathmandu, and they would sit on my lap. And they would write in a journal. I would teach them some basic English or mathematics, and they just loved to learn. I mean, they ate it up, and the passion for learning was astonishing because I'd never seen it before. Growing up in public school systems here, it seemed like everybody had an apathy towards education. Nobody cared to learn it, and I didn't care to learn. I was on this 10-year program, and I started thinking, these kids, they're not poor because they're lazy or because they're not intelligent. It's because of a lack of opportunity. And you start learning, once you're not part of a family and they're homeless, they weren't allowed in the public school systems. And they were part of this larger kind of group of boys. And the larger boys would come over and would beat them and would take food away from them if I was to buy them some rice or some milk or let them have some pens to write on a piece of paper. And as soon as they left my bubble, they were beginning to get picked on, and they would lose their items. And I had a little bit of an epiphany here. And I saw a glimpse of these young boys' futures, these 8-year-old innocent boys. I thought they're going to turn out just like these older boys. And it's going to destroy who they are and their innocence and their desire and passion for learning. And so it was at that moment that I made a decision to do something different and that, to go and finish my education for one of them. But how can we help these people? And so the first lesson I learned, though, is that oftentimes people are a product of their environment, and poverty is a result of a lack of opportunity oftentimes and not a result of laziness or unintelligence or whatever we may think poverty is a result of. And so that's the first lesson. The second lesson came from, after this, I moved to Kenya actually for 6 months. I was recently married. My wife and I it was essentially a honeymoon. We moved to a mud hut, just like the one on that first picture, and lived there for 6 months. And the funny thing about this story is we wanted to learn about working in this environment. How can we change the world? We went to work for an NGO and a humanitarian group. And the project they put us on was building these Loreno stoves and getting this Loreno stove project functioning in East Africa. And it only took about a month. I realized that people don't want a Loreno stove in East Africa. A Loreno stove is this stove that takes smoke out of the household, and you can burn fires more efficiently. But it only took a little bit of observation to realize that people stored their maize above the fires that they cooked on, and it acted as a natural pesticide. And it preserved their maize through the dry season. But yet, we had this NGO wanting us to go out there and implement these in everybody's house. And we thought, okay, now we have to have expensive pesticides. They're taking chemicals in. Like, that's not a solution. And so what we did is I restructured our whole program, our whole internship in this village in East Africa, and said, we're going to go listen to what people want. And we designed needs assessments and went around household to household, interviewing people after people, wives, husbands, children, and understanding what life was like, doing these little mini ethnographies to understand what life was like in that environment and listening to what people really wanted. This also came from this kind of research as we were going along. We found that oftentimes good intentions had unintended consequences. So we met some people in rural Africa, and I was in areas where they'd never even seen white people before. I'm very remote, very remote. And a family sat down and told me once, I said, why aren't your children in school? You have a cow, you're one of the wealthiest people in this environment that we've been meeting. Your children are one of the few that don't go to school. It's like, well, we've heard that there are white people that will come over and sponsor our children. And we've been waiting for that. And it was debilitating, and it was hindering these people from developing and helping themselves. And we started recognizing these various patterns throughout, that it was debilitating and causing dependency oftentimes through our good intentions. And so there are these unintended consequences to our actions. We also found that a lot of subsistence farmers in these areas were now being forced to operate in the market where they didn't know how to do that. Historically and generationally, they've been farmers. But now with market globalization and family sizes growing, and you can't only divide a farm so far until it can't sustain you anymore, and turning to market for survival. And microfinance and stuff had stepped in and helped out in this space and providing loans to these individuals to grow and start businesses to be more successful. But then this is where my next lesson came along, was when I started doing impact assessments on microcredit groups. And I spent a number of months going from household to household, interviewing women who are getting microcredit loans, and what are they doing with these loans, and how are they growing their businesses, how successful are they. And I started to realize that not that many people are entrepreneurial, really. And it was a bit naive to think that we can just give out all these loans and that people can go and start a business. And if you think about it, in the U.S., it's roughly, in business school, they talk about it's around 10% of the population that would be naturally entrepreneurial. I mean, how many people here think you're entrepreneurial or would consider yourself an entrepreneur? Raise your hands. Well, it looks like probably about the same thing. Roughly around 10% here would resonate as being an entrepreneur. Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, 72% of the population operate in the informal economy, selling trinkets or little goods or tomatoes or whatever it is to eke out a living as what I call a necessity entrepreneur or a forced entrepreneur. They're forced into doing this to survive. They're not doing it because they think they can grow the best tomato or that those fish, they can catch the best fish or they have the best product. They're doing it because they need to do something to earn a buck so they can put food on their table. And so there's so many groups nowadays that kind of focus on this idea of let's create entrepreneurs. And I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in using entrepreneurship as the solution to global poverty. I think we need to go to another route. And I think the other route is this kind of concept that we created when I went to the university. So I took a position at BYU after doing a lot of this research as a research associate, part-time, and it grew into a full-time position there. And we created this kind of concept called microfranchising, where we'll take a business, we systematize it, and then we replicate it so it can scale. So go back, we create a business, we identify market needs, we identify what consumers want, we create a brand, we create the model around how it operates, price points, packaging, everything you need to run that business, and take it from one person, and then we can give that business to many. And what it does is it alleviates the entrepreneurial burden. There's a burden of being entrepreneurial, and it's this innovative, creative, how do I sell, what do I sell, how much do I sell it for, how do I market, how do I advertise it? And that's difficult, especially for people who have no education living in very rough, difficult environments. And so we help alleviate that and provide somebody with an opportunity to own and run a business. And there's a big difference between being a business owner and an entrepreneur, and that's what we try to focus on, is how to create economically self-sustaining livelihoods through letting people be business owners and not forcing them in this box of being an innovative entrepreneur. Now here's an example of one of the businesses we've worked with a bit, and this is in Ghana. This group here is a microfranchise called Fan Milk. They sell ice cream at 30 cents a pop at a small little sachet. They have scaled to employ 10,000 young men in Ghana. Last year they had $72 million in revenue, $20 million in profit. This company was so successful in Ghana that they've now scaled into Benin. They have over 10,000 in Nigeria. They're opening up a number of other West African countries because they're profitable, they're helping people, and they're scaling. And I did a 3-year longitudinal study with this group, and what we found was there was a high retention rate, and they were earning roughly twice as much as their counterparts were in microcredit and standalone businesses in the same market. So it was benefiting the microfranchisee running this business, and it was also benefiting the franchisor as well. And so when I was at the university, I had a number of publications, put out a number of books and articles on this kind of concept of microfranchising. But as I just mentioned, that research, we found that there wasn't a lot of research. In fact, we created this idea, this concept of microfranchising, but there were actually organizations out there doing it. They just weren't calling it microfranchising. From that initial research, we found 2 or 3 organizations that were doing this idea of systematizing a small business and scaling it and branding. But we put a term on it, but there's been no real research. So we set out to do this 3-year longitudinal research. And our basic findings were that it dramatically reduced the risk of the individual in starting up a business because they had a proven product that's been tested in the market, price points are there, the branding is there, brands are very strong, particularly in developing markets. We found that the franchisees were earning nearly twice as much as their counterparts. In this case, with this group in Guatemala, we found that if we averaged out aggregately the amount of money they made per day, it was only slightly higher than a microcredit borrower or a standalone business. But when we broke it down by hourly rate, it was nearly 3 to 4 times higher because they had to put less effort into running this business so they could allocate other time to their family activities. And we found that retention was very high. That 3 years later, the same 100 people that were in the microfranchises, 95% of them were still there 3 years later. When we looked at the microcredit and the standalone businesses 3 years later, it was the opposite. There was only a very few amount of them that were still doing the same business 3 years later, and they were still earning less money than they were 3 years ago. And because they had that burden of being an entrepreneur and deciding what kind of businesses to run. So we have a process that we use implementing all of this, and it starts with our research and design. You know, we do observations, we do what we call market safari. I take pictures of people's trash. We do a lot of interviews, listening to people. We do mini ethnographies. And it's really important to listen to what people want. And that's part of this research and design. I want to tell you one story here. When I was in a rural village, and I had this woman come to me, and we were doing this vast market analysis, trying to understand what people need, and this woman held out her hands. And she showed me her hands, and she said, I work in the fields all day long. She said, my hands are cracked, they're bleeding, they're sore. I feel like an animal. I feel like livestock. She's like, if anything, if you could bring some lotion, some cosmetics, some things to my village, when I put that on, it makes me feel like a woman. It makes me feel like a human again. And that was another second epiphany for me, because that was the point I realized we come into these markets so often with our assumptions that people want access to electricity, they want healthcare, they want access to clean water. And these are needs, but we're so presumptuous to say nobody needs makeup. I'm not going to sell cosmetics in these markets. That's not what these people need. And I realized that I don't want to be that arrogant or presumptuous to assume what other people want and are willing to spend their money on it, but I want to listen to what they want. And if that makes that woman feel like a woman and it makes her feel happy and it increases her self-esteem, I'm going to sell cosmetics in those villages. And that's been core to one of our processes, identifying needs. From there, we test, we iterate, we see a business plan as a hypothesis. that we test and we modify and we change as we go, and we iterate and we modify, and then we are able to launch, replicate, and scale. And I know what I'm talking about. Changing the world is difficult, but I think using design principles to design models for the 4 billion poor is how we can change the world. And sometimes it may feel like you're wrestling a crocodile, but I guarantee you, the guy that takes 10 years to get through graduate was quicker. Undergraduate school, 10 years to get through undergraduate school, can wrestle a crocodile, can work in the space. Anybody can do it. Thank you.